If you guys want one-on-one training, online training, or nutritional coaching, please head on over to my website, jpfitnesspro.com. Just go to the services tab and select which one you would like. You can also subscribe to my newsletter and contact me through my website as well. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks. What is up, everybody? This is JP here, and I'm coming at you with another episode of the Exercise Science Podcast. This episode is going to be on muscle confusion, and I'm also going to touch on exercise selection a little bit. But before we get into that, I'm going to give you guys the one random fact about me, is that tomorrow, Thursday, the date will be the 17th of January, 2019. The Mortal Kombat 11 reveal is going to happen at 10:30. I think it's Pacific Standard Time. So if you're a big video game fan, specifically a big fighting game fan, and even more specifically a big Mortal Kombat fan, I definitely check that out. They're going to go over the game mechanics, they're going to go over the characters, they're going to go over pretty much almost everything about the entire game, if not everything. So I'm definitely going to be tuning into that since I'm a huge Mortal Kombat fan. Let me know what games you guys like, or let me know a random fact about you so I could get to know my subscriber base a little bit better. But alright, like I said, this episode is going to be about muscle confusion. And even though exercise is getting more, exercise science is getting further, we're getting a little bit better. I mean, we're kind of getting worse in some areas, but we're kind of getting better as a whole. I think that, like, with YouTube getting big around, 2005, 2006, since YouTube getting so big, there has been, like, obviously fitness has been a huge thing in YouTube, and that's kind of like hurt the fitness industry in a lot of ways. And then that combined with the fact that a ton of people take gear these days, you get someone on YouTube or another big platform, mainly YouTube though, saying, that this is how you do something and this is the best way to gain muscle. They don't cite their sources, but because they're on all types of gear and they're low body fat and they're pretty big or they're strong, that a lot of people believe them, which sucks because, again, that's not how you should base whether or not someone says something is true. I can get someone who doesn't know anything about exercise, they can get on gear and then they can work out with me and they'll get jacked, and then if they tell someone, oh, this is how you do it, I guarantee you they'll get a bunch of followers. I could literally set that up, which I'm not saying I'd ever do, but I'm just saying I could literally set that up and I'd bet every dollar that I had that person would get a following, and I could tell that person to say things that are completely incorrect, that are just straight wrong. I could have them make up stuff and say, oh, you got to do this, and this is the best way to get gain muscle, and because they look good, and that they're gonna get a lot of people listening to them. But because of YouTube and things like this, it's some areas of exercise, the evidence-based community and everyone in general, it kind of suffers a little bit from that. Especially if you're not part of, like, the more evidence-based community of exercise, you're definitely just probably getting confused or misled in some way. But what I'm trying to get at is that even though some areas we're doing worse, like with YouTube and fitness, but some areas we're doing better because, exercise science is getting further. You have, the leaders in exercise, hopefully doing exercise justice and giving out correct information. We still get topics like muscle confusion come up. I still see it, I still hear it, I still read about it. I still see people say I'll be working out at the gym, and this is another thing that bothers me. Like, I don't like going into rants, you guys. I really don't. I'm trying not to turn a podcast into rants, but I guess it does bother me when I see this. I'll be working out in the gym, and then I'll see someone start training someone right there, like their friend or someone they know, and it's like, no other industry does that happen, And again, I mean, who's at fault? It's probably, I guess it's exercise's fault in general, the community, and then just the profession, because we don't really have a major governing body. Like, like I said, with other fields, you can't pretend to be that person in particular. You can't pretend to be a doctor, you can't pretend to be a registered dietitian, you can't pretend to be a physical therapist. All those things will get you jail time at worst, and at the very best, you'll be harming someone. And depending on where you're at in the world or where you're listening to this, anyone can call themselves a personal trainer. At least in the United States you can. And I'm pretty sure in almost every state, I think it might be different from state to state, but it's not illegal to call yourself a personal trainer. Now, if you get into legal trouble and you don't have any certification, it might be harder to make a case for yourself. But so yeah, I guess the profession is part to blame in certain circumstances like that, because I'm not saying that to be a personal trainer, it's as hard to be a personal trainer as it is to be a doctor. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think it's harder than most people give it credit for. I don't think to be a good trainer, you can do that in the matter of a weekend, because there are weekend courses. And I don't think that you can do that in a month, And in my personal opinion, I don't even think that the certifications that are out there are enough. Most of them don't give hands-on experience. I wish that, personal trainers were like, maybe like the minimum for a certification would be 6 months study. And then, about, you have to have a certain amount of hours of contact time. Something like, I don't know, maybe you could say they have to have 50 hours of contact time or something, which would be roughly, 2 hours every 25 weeks, which would be half a year, or 26 weeks, something like that. So you have to go in 2 hours a week, and those are consistent hours. Every single week you're getting 2 hours of just training of in person, And I think then you could get the barrier of entry to be a baseline certification, or a baseline personal trainer. Now I just made that up on the spot. I might, if I thought about it, it might be longer. But again, we don't have that. You just call yourself a personal trainer, or go get a weekend certification, which sucks. So we're partly to blame, and the people doing this are still partly to blame as well, because I still think that you need to analyze your situation and analyze yourself and say, well, I don't know personal training, I don't study, but so why am I giving advice? But I'll still see it. I'll constantly see people telling people, oh no, you need to do it like this, man. You need to do it like this. You need to do it like this. Oh no, do it right here. This is how you squeeze. And when you squeeze it, oh yeah, you got to go up like this. If you do it, yeah, man. Oh, do you feel it better? Yeah. And like, they'll be telling people, and like, all it takes is like a wrong cue on a squat for someone. Maybe one person sees their friend or a stranger, and people do this with strangers too. I call them the personal trainer police or gym police, and I don't do this at all. I never do this because it's extremely annoying. But I mean, unless someone's in absolute danger, I won't hop in. But you'll see someone walk up to someone and give them advice, and all it takes is for one person to see someone not squatting as low as they think's okay, and they say, oh, you got to go all the way down. It doesn't, you're losing out on gains, bruh. And then they tell them to go all the way down, and then, they go all the way down, and what do you know? That person wasn't built for squats, and they shouldn't have gone all the way down, and because they have long femurs and just, where their feet are positioned during that rep, it makes them have to have a heavy forward lean, and then bam, they don't have good form. They get extreme, posterior pelvic tilt. Not just a little bit. I'm talking about a ridiculous amount. And well, there you go. They got a herniated disc, and just because one person gave them a tip, and that's a very reasonable, practical scenario, because it happens all the time. People give advice like that all the time. But I'm not trying to get into all that. All I'm saying is that, like, I still see things about muscle confusion, and there's a lot of ways we could point fingers, but it still happens. I thought we were a little bit past this sometimes. Sometimes I think we are, but then I hear someone say something, and I'm like, well, there you go again, but sorry to get into that little rant, but this is a podcast, so I feel free to talk a little bit more. So muscle confusion, what is it? A lot of people, you may hear people say, especially if you've heard this a while ago, or, just depending on where you're reading it, you may hear people say that you have to confuse the muscle to keep it to grow. If you don't confuse the muscle, then you're not going to be able to keep growing. You're not going to be able to keep, that muscle's just going to either plateau or it's going to get smaller. And by muscle confusion, they mean you need to purposely mix things up. And it could be mix things up in regards to, rep ranges. It could be mixed things up in regards to intensity, but usually it's mixed things up like exercise wise, because that's why I said I'm also going to touch on exercise selection a little bit, because it kind of ties into this. But people say, if you don't mix things up every once in a while, switch everything up, that you're gonna plateau, when that just isn't the case, and this is what stems from just people not knowing, ignorance, and then speaking outside of that ignorance, and maybe the Dunning-Kruger effect a little bit. People will think they know more than they do when they really know pretty much absolutely nothing. They know worse than nothing, because some people cannot know something. They're actually thinking they know something when they don't know, and then that's the correct exact opposite. So instead of just not knowing nothing and not speaking on it, they're doing even worse than that by giving information that's strongly incorrect. So, and that's just them from not knowing. So you have to ask the first question is, what causes muscle growth? first, so once you know that question, you can kind of say, okay, well, so that causes muscle growth. So first, you need to have, assuming that everything else is the same, and everything else is controlled and okay. We're not talking about exceptions here. You're going to get one person listening to this and they're going to say, well, what if you don't get enough sleep? Or what if you don't get in your protein? That's not what I'm talking about. Assuming everything else is good, sleep, protein, you induce muscle growth by applying the proper stimulus, and that's lifting with heavy loads, moderately heavy loads, relatively close to failure, or light loads to failure. And the bottom threshold for our light loads would be around 30% 1 rep max. So anything, if you're going below 30% 1 rep max, you start risking that you're pretty much risking that you're not making optimal gains, even if you go to failure. If you're 30% 1 rep max or higher in load, that as long as you're going to failure, you'll make gains. And when you start going 60% or higher 1 rep max, you don't have to go to failure. You just have to be relatively close to failure. You can't be like 10 reps away from failure and expect to make optimal gains. You're going to be making suboptimal gains at that point. So once you have that stimulus, so you're saying, okay, so wow, so that's what happens is if I do that, I'll gain muscle. With everything else controlled, yes, you will gain muscle if you do that. So if you lift some heavy stuff. Now, the reason why the heavy stuff, I don't dictate that it has to be relatively close to failure, because that's automatically implied. If it's not heavy, then you're not. If it's heavy, like you're training 6 reps or below and it's of adequate percentage of 1 rep max, you're going to be with relatively close to failure automatically. Now, moderately heavy loads, you can train moderately heavy loads and not make optimal gains. Like if you're training with your 12 to 15 rep max and you do 4 reps with it or 5 reps with it, you're 10 reps away from failure almost. Or 7 reps or more from failure, which is kind of too far away from failure to be to maximize gains from that set. So again, that's why I don't say that with heavy loads. But so once you have that, then you say, okay, so what if I just do heavy loads? I don't have to be relatively close to failure. Do I just do 1 set? Do I do 1 rep of a heavy load? How is that it? I just make gains forever? No. Volume, how much you do in the gym dictates magnitude of adaptation. So when you if you do this intelligently, and I say this intelligently, the more you do in the gym, the more gains you'll make. Now again, intelligently, because there is diminishing returns, and I can come up with a dozen scenarios where increasing volume wouldn't be the wise thing. And you don't need a rush to increase volume either. I'm just saying that you want to intelligently increase volume over time, and volume itself is strongly correlated with increases in volume means more gains in regards to hypertrophy. And that's what I mean by muscle confusion, because I don't really hear muscle confusion in regards to strength as much. But if this all can apply to strength as well. If someone says, oh, you need to confuse the muscles to keep getting strong, it's the same thing. I might touch upon that as well, though, too. So that's, now that we know what causes muscle growth, you need a specific amount of tension. I guess that's what percent of 1 rep max is. You need a specific amount of tension. And once you, depending on how much tension is on that muscle, again, that's just the same thing as saying percentage of 1 rep max. You may or may not need to go to failure. You still have to be moderately close to failure, though. You can't be like, again, 10, 15 reps away from failure and be like, oh, I'm going to make optimal gains. Now that we know that that's what's going to cause hypertrophy, and then volume dictates the magnitude of hypertrophy, like how big your muscles get. Obviously, if you have been doing 2 sets per muscle group per week for a while, and then you increase to 4 or 5 sets per muscle group per week, you're probably, if with all else controlled, you're going to make more gains. You're going to get more jacked. So now thinking about this, think about it. You have to have a certain amount of tension to be able to make gains. Now, we know that volume dictates the magnitude of adaptation. You want to have more volume over time if you want more hypertrophy. And strength does have a relationship with volume, but it's not as heavily of a relationship as hypertrophy is. So you will make more gains, or you will make more strength gains if you do more volume, but again, it's not going to be as much of an impact as it would on hypertrophy. So, obviously, if you're doing 1 set of heavy squats per week and then you go to 2 or 3 heavy sets of squats per week, you're probably going to make better strength gains over the long run. So, again, that volume dictates the magnitude of adaptation. So, knowing these things, you have to understand is when you have an exercise, let's just say you have a squat. We're just going to take a back squat. Our goal with the back squat is to do more volume, and you could one is to do more volume if we want to make more hypertrophy gains. And again, by doing more volume, again, remember what I said earlier, is you have to do this intelligently. You're not just gonna, oh, he said do more volume, I'll do 20 sets of squats every single day. No, it's not gonna work like that. There's a point of diminishing returns, and there's a point where if you start doing too much, you'll lead to overreaching, which leads to overtraining, which leads to, you're gonna start regressing in progress. So so what we want to do here is, let's just say we take the squat and we're doing a squat, for example. Let's just say we're just doing the squat. Let's just say the squat's the only exercise we're doing, for an example. If you're starting with 100 pounds on the squat and you're a beginner, let's just say you start with 100 pounds. A beginner is going to be able to increase the weight they put on the bar, workout to workout, maybe. It's not everyone, but probably, and definitely week to week, definitely. So the person may, from workout to workout, go from 100 to 105 pounds to 110 pounds, to 120 pounds to 125 pounds. And then let's just say they try to go up to 130, but they can't make the rep range. Let's just say it's a 9 to 12 rep range. And then they have to start increasing every week. Every week they do squats, they increase it. Then 5 pounds, they go to 135, 140, 145, or 150, and they keep going up and up and up. There's going to be a point where they plateau. But think about it. When they're increasing this weight, even if they're not doing any more sets, they're increasing, for every single rep they do, they're doing more weight, which means they're doing more volume load, which means that over this period where they're adding weight to the bar on their squats, even if we don't add any more sets, they're increasing volume. So if they're if they're relatively close to failure, which is what I said earlier, you need to cause hypertrophy to a muscle, and then you're increasing weight week to week to week, you're increasing volume, which is going to increase the magnitude of adaptation you have. You're going to get bigger muscles if everything else is doing good, with adequate sleep and protein and stuff. So yes, that's a case where you're fitting those two things. You have the proper stimulus, you're training relatively close to failure, and then you're increasing volume load intelligently over time. That dictates how much. So you have the stimulus to cause muscle growth, and then you have more of that stimulus to cause more and more muscle growth. And that's just with one exercise. We didn't switch any exercises. Switching things up just to confuse the muscle. Again, now taking that example that I had, what would happen if we just removed the squat? Like, let's just say 3 weeks in or 2 weeks in, let's just say we started at 100 pounds and we got to 120 pounds. And then we just said, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go do a goblet squat now or something. And if you don't know what a goblet squat is, it's like a body weight squat where you have a dumbbell in your hands. And you're holding the dumbbell in front of you about chest high. So you're holding the dumbbell with both hands and you're holding it chest high and you're squatting down like that. So let's just say you remove the back squat and you say, well, muscle confusion. I've been doing that for 4 weeks and I go to the dumbbell goblet squat. Now, while the goblet squat may work slightly, or I don't want to say work, it may prefer slightly different musculature than the regular back squat, depending on how your back squat was. If you were doing like a wide stance, low bar squat, and you have long femurs and your knees didn't go forward at all, you're probably getting very little quad activation in the squat. Maybe that when you switch over to the goblet squat, you're getting a little bit more quad activation in regards to like your joints and just the biomechanics of that exercise. If your knees are a little bit more forward with a goblet squat, you can have a little bit a more narrow stance. Again, like I said, your knees go a little bit more forward. There's going to be more quad involvement for that exercise. But if you look at what's happening there, let's just say you take the back squat and compare it. You're not someone who's doing 120 or 130 pound back squat for 10 reps, 9 to 12 rep range, relatively close to failure, is not going to be able to go to a goblet squat and do a 120 pound dumbbell goblet squat. There's no way in hell it's going to happen. They'll maybe be able to do like a 30, 40, 50 pounds is even pushing it. For someone who can only back squat that much, to me that shows it's not a relatively strong individual. And anyone in relation to their back squat is not going to be able to goblet squat nearly as much. You're kind of limited by how much you can hold. So in this sense, you shifted a little bit of the biomechanics, but you lowered the overall amount of tension, and the limiting factor is probably now your grip in your upper body and how big of a dumbbell you can hold. So in this sense, we confused, or whatever people say, like they say muscle confusion just by switching the exercise, remove the back squat, and then we're actually having lower overall tension on that muscle group. When we had that big barbell exercise like the squat, we're going to get more volume load. The goblet squat is not going to be able to put nearly as much tension on the muscle groups, the glutes, the quads, and the hamstrings to a certain extent. The spinal erectors, it's just not going to cause as much. It's not going to be nearly as much tension to any specific muscle group. It might shift the biomechanics a little bit, but you're lowering overall tension, which is just going to lower volume load completely. Again, it's just not going to be as strenuous on your legs. In general, it's just not going to. Now, see, so that's what some people may do with muscle confusion, is they may just switch the exercise and say, voila, now we'll continue to make gains. But in that specific instance, you might get a little bit more hypertrophy in the quads. Maybe that's a stretch right there, because you're still getting less tension, but you might. But everything else is probably going to, and probably even the quads too, just because there's less tension. But overall, you're just going to, if you're not adding more sets or doing anything else, let's just say you're taking one exercise and going to another, keeping the same sets and using the weight that's hard for you in that 9 to 12 rep range, you're getting a lot less tension applied to that muscle group, and less volume load. You're probably going to regress. Now, because you're holding a dumbbell, you might actually gain some chest hypertrophy, because you have to squeeze the dumbbell to hold it. You might get a little shoulder hypertrophy from holding that dumbbell up like that. You'll probably get more upper body gains a little bit doing a goblet squat than you would, but your whole lower body musculature is going to probably regress. You'll probably lose gains and get smaller by just making that switch. Because again, you have to think of what happened there is that the stimulus is in place, but you got to think of, it's just less of a stimulus than what it was for a barbell back squat. So that's what happens when you just simply say, oh, I'm going to switch exercises and cause muscle confusion. Now, there are other ways that this could be brought up. So let me go back to that actually real quick. And kind of close that out. So when people say, look, they just switch exercises and they're just switching exercises, when you're just switching exercises, you're just probably changing the biomechanics that are going on a little bit between one exercise and the next. You're probably shifting focus to other slightly shifting focus to other muscle groups. As long as you're sticking, I'm talking about if you're switching from one similar exercise to another. Obviously, it's going to be a completely different muscle group if we're talking about going from a leg exercise to a back exercise. But I'm talking about if it's a leg day to leg day and you're switching everything up, you're probably just changing which joints are coming into play more, which muscle groups are coming into play more. And you're changing lots of other things, ranges of motion, depending on what exercise it is, whether it's like a compound or an isolation. But that's it. You're just changing things. The stimulus that's required for hypertrophy, you're not necessarily increasing just by changing exercises. Now, you may change. It may increase the stimulus for hypertrophy depending on what it is. Now, let's reverse the scenario. Let's just say you started off with bodyweight squats, and then you're like, okay, well, now it's time. I feel okay with a bodyweight squats or a goblet squat. Now I want to go to a barbell back squat. You're now working with heavier loads, and in that sense, you're getting more of that stimulus that's going to induce muscular hypertrophy. So, but if you're still doing that with the sense of, let's just say you did that by accident, and you're like, well, I'm gonna muscle confusion. Let's switch things up. That just tells me that later on, you're probably going to switch out the back squat for something else again. So you have to think about just changing things up is simply that. You're just changing which muscle groups are probably being used or recruited for that exercise, the joint angles, the range of motion specifically for that exercise, and other factors. But that's it. What exercise you do does not determine what exercise you do, and other components of the exercise does not determine how much hypertrophy you get or whether you get hypertrophy. That's the simplest way to put it. It doesn't matter. What matters is basically the amount of tension on that muscle group, how much tension you can apply. And that's the same thing as saying relatively close to failure. If you're doing reps relatively close to failure, tension can be applied as like the amount of load. But I mean, like, in the sense of, when you're relatively close to failure, you're fatiguing that muscle adequately, but you still need to be able to apply tension in regards to 1 rep max. So Like I said earlier, if you're going below 30% 1 rep max, even if you train to failure, you're going to be leaving gains on the table, which means you're not applying adequate amounts of tension. Now, so when you think about switching exercises, again, that's not necessarily changing an exercise may or may not do anything for those. You're just changing specific things. Changing those components of an exercise is not going to dictate whether or not you make more gains. Let me give you another example. Is sometimes people that back squat to goblet squat is just one example. Sometimes people will take different angles when they talk about muscle confusion. They'll say, let's do a body weight squat or some squat, and then they'll introduce a stability ball into there. This is a kind of not a popular one, but this does happen a lot. I wouldn't say popular though, but a lot of the times people use stability balls for other things, for certain things. But again, I do see it used for hypertrophy. People will say, oh, this is muscle confusion. We're confusing the muscle. We're making it, harder for you to balance, and it's confusing the muscle, which means that you're going to make more gains, which just is not the case. What happens is, let's just say you went from a body weight squat to now you're doing a squat on a Bosu ball. You're not able to apply the proper amount of tension to that muscle group to be able to induce muscular hypertrophy or to maximize it. Think about it. If you're going to get on a Bosu ball, you're just focused on balancing. You can't apply the proper amount of tension because you're not going to be able to control the proper amount of tension required to induce muscular hypertrophy. So on one end of the spectrum, you have a leg press. Let's just take a leg press, for example. A leg press has very high stability, requires little to no balance on your part. You're just pushing a platform in a very linear pattern. And because there's very little balance and stability required on your part, and the machine itself, a leg press, is already giving you very high stability just with the way that it's structured, you're able to properly overload the muscle, put the required amount of tension on there, and you're able to do enough repetitions or enough load to get you relatively close to failure. So that's with the leg press, with the machine. And again, there's other things that we can consider downsides to a leg press or whatever. But again, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a single leg Bosu ball squat, which requires very high stability required from you, the lifter, and it's gonna be hard to balance. Unless you're someone who can do that really well. But even then, you're just not going to be able to put enough load on yourself while doing a single leg Bosu ball squat to be able to properly overload the muscle groups that are working to get it to that certain threshold where you can, again, induce muscular hypertrophy. And even if you induce muscular hypertrophy, are you able to get enough volume load to increase or to get more of that magnitude of adaptation? And it's going to be, unless, again, I don't know of anyone that could possibly do that on this planet, but again, you just got to think of the muscle groups. Like if you have, let's just say you're doing a single leg Bosu ball squat. Now let's take a single leg press. How much can you lift on a single leg press? We could do all the math and find out how much tension is required for you to induce muscular hypertrophy. But then we can do the same thing. Or once we figure that out, then we say, okay, well, how much tension are you actually putting on your muscles in a single leg Bosu ball squat? Now, there may be some differences in biomechanics, but if we figure that out, we're going to be like, okay, well, you need X amount of tension, or whatever that is. However that equate to putting a barbell on your back, which again, would you even be able to stand with a barbell on your back doing a single leg Bosu ball squat? You probably wouldn't even be able to hold a dumbbell. So you're not going to be able to put barely any tension on there. Most people won't even be able to do one single rep. So in regards to opposites of those spectrums is, some people will say that muscle confusion is just, they'll take that angle and say that. They'll say that, this induces muscle confusion. But in reality, the stimulus required for you to induce muscular hypertrophy is non-existent in this case. At least with the goblet squat example, going from a back squat to a goblet squat, you're still getting that, you can still get some leg hypertrophy from a goblet squat, but you were kind of doing less, which probably means you're regressed. In this example, you're probably getting no stimulus to induce muscular hypertrophy. Now, we could even use not even an exaggerated example. Some people will do single leg
single leg squats on a TRX, which isn't a bad example. I mean, a bad exercise. But think about it. Most people, I mean, depending on you, if you don't can't have regular balance or coordination, you might not be able to put enough tension on that muscle to be able to induce muscular hypertrophy. Because again, there is that certain tension threshold, and if the tension is not high enough, you're going to have to take it to failure. If you're doing a ton of reps, you're going to have to take it to failure, because again, the percentage of 1 rep max is pretty low. So using those two examples, we know that just simply switching exercises or simply doing something else is not enough to induce muscular hypertrophy. That doesn't do that at all. Now, it could, depending on what exercise you're switching it to, especially if you're going from like a less stable exercise to a more stable exercise, because again, when we have higher stability, we're able to overload that muscle more. We're not worried about balance. We're not worried about all the other stuff. Like, for example, if you go from a barbell, I love a barbell back squat, but if you go from a barbell back squat to a machine leg press, you might get more hypertrophy because there's less stability. It's a less skillful movement. Yes, it's less stability required on you doing a leg press. You get more stability from the machine, and it's just a less skillful movement. You're just pushing a platform in one direction. You're not going to be able to go up, down, left, and right. It's just forward and backward, and it's pretty self-explanatory how to do it. It's easy. Where our barbell back squats are more complex. Now, there are some give and takes here because, again, obviously with the barbell back squat, you're going to get more core involvement. You're going to get more work on the spinal erectors. You're probably, depending on what type of squat you're doing, if I said a back squat, but if you're doing a front squat, you're going to be getting a ton of upper back work. So yeah, there's a lot of other musculature brought in with a barbell back squat because it is a big barbell compound movement. There's more required to do that in the sense of musculature recruited. So in that sense, and plus a barbell back squat isn't such an exercise that most people do once and then they fall down. It doesn't require, most people can balance with the barbell back squat. So in that sense, you're actually having an exercise that requires more stability, which has more upsides than versus something like a leg press where you're virtually getting no core involvement. You're not getting any work on the spinal erectors. You're just hitting those muscle groups, which, that's why, you see bodybuilders or talk of bodybuilders having to do, a lot of work. They like to do a lot of isolation work. They do isolation work for each muscle group, which is typically why, because if they're not doing those big compound movements that recruit a lot of musculature, you're going to kind of have to make up for those little muscle groups somewhere else by doing more exercises. But again, that's a talk for another time. But again, that's the point of this podcast, was to let you know is that when making exercise selections, simply switching from one exercise to another is not going to get you any more it's not going to get you any more gains. It's not going to make you stronger. It's not going to make you gain more muscle. It doesn't do that. And then that's the same thing with strength too. I don't really touch up on strength, but strength is just specific to what you're doing. When someone says, "Oh, I'm strong," what are you strong at? Are you strong at arm wrestling? Are you strong at, you have a strong grip? Are you strong in the squat? If you just say you're strong, that doesn't mean anything. You just say, what are you? Do you mean you're strong in everyday activities, picking groceries up? What is it? So strength is specific. So if you're switching random exercises and you're not training in the exercise you want to get strong at, that's just a principle of specificity at play. So again, you have to think about what causes muscular hypertrophy, and then how do you, whenever you find that stimulus, like I talked about, how do you get more of that? And we already talked about that. So, so again, when someone says muscle confusion, well, what does that even mean? And now you guys know that, again, simply switching exercises, all you're doing is changing the biomechanics of the exercise. All you're doing is maybe recruiting slightly different musculature, but it doesn't mean that tension is higher. And which, again, if you're not having proper tension or enough tension, you're not getting enough volume load, you may actually be regressing in regards to gains. If you guys have any questions, comments, leave them down below. I know that some of these podcasts can be a little off the beaten path, but that's why they're podcasts and they're not videos. Again, if something was a little bit confusing, you guys can ask me any questions. I'll answer them, but I'll see you guys in the next video.